Joseph Stalin was one of history's most powerful and controversial leaders. He ruled the Soviet Union for over 25 years, shaping it into a global power. His rule was marked by major transformations in industry and the military. However, it also included harsh oppression and widespread suffering for the people. Stalin was both feared and admired. Some viewed him as a strong leader who defended his country, while others saw him as a ruthless dictator responsible for millions of deaths. Stalin held two important positions: General Secretary of the Communist Party, 1922–1953, and Premier of the Soviet State, 1941–1953. These roles gave him immense control over Soviet society. As General Secretary, he used his power to strengthen his position and eliminate rivals. His leadership style was strict and authoritarian, leaving no room for opposition. Stalin's impact on the Soviet Union was enormous. He led industrialization, turning the country into a major economy. At the same time, he used fear to maintain his rule. Stalin's policies changed the Soviet Union into a modern superpower. Yet, his methods caused immense human suffering, including mass famine and political terror. Despite these costs, Stalin was seen by many as a hero who helped defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. He played a key role in shaping global politics during the 20th century. Today, Stalin's legacy remains debated. Some focus on his achievements in modernizing the Soviet Union, while others condemn his actions as brutal and inhumane. Joseph Stalin was born on December 18, 1878, in Gori, a small town in Georgia. At that time, Georgia was part of the Russian Empire. His birth name was Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili. Stalin's family was poor. His father, Vissarion, worked as a cobbler, but often spent his earnings on alcohol. His mother, Kiki, worked as a washerwoman to support the family. Vissarion was abusive and frequently beat both Stalin and his mother. Despite the hardships, Kiki wanted her son to have a better future and encouraged him to get an education. Stalin began his education at the local church school in Gori in 1888. He was an excellent student and quickly impressed his teachers. He was fluent in Georgian, his native language. At school, Stalin learned Russian, which he spoke with a strong Georgian accent throughout his life. His ability to learn and adapt stood out, even in his early years. However, Stalin's childhood was not easy. He contracted smallpox, which left his face scarred. Later, he injured his arm in an accident, leaving one arm shorter than the other. After finishing school in Gori, Stalin enrolled at the Tiflis Theological Seminary in 1894. His mother hoped he would become a priest, but Stalin had other interests. While at the seminary, he began secretly reading banned books, including works by Karl Marx. These ideas inspired him and led him toward revolutionary thinking. Stalin was eventually expelled from the seminary in 1899. Officially, this was due to poor health, but others believe it was because of his growing interest in revolutionary politics. Despite leaving the seminary, Stalin remained determined to make an impact. His early years shaped his strong will, ambition, and readiness to fight for what he believed. The hardships of his childhood taught him how to endure challenges, while his education introduced him to the ideas that would guide his future actions. Stalin's early life set the stage for his rise in the revolutionary movement. His ability to overcome obstacles and learn quickly became key traits in his later career. After leaving the seminary in 1899, Stalin began his life as a revolutionary. He joined secret political groups that supported Marxism and aimed to overthrow the Tsarist government. In 1900, Stalin became more active in organizing strikes and protests among workers in the Caucasus region. He focused on spreading revolutionary ideas through illegal publications. These activities brought him to the attention of the police. In 1902, Stalin was arrested for the first time and sent into exile in Siberia, a cold and remote area of Russia. Stalin escaped from exile in 1904 and returned to his political work. He became involved with the Bolsheviks, a faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, believed in using force to bring about revolution. Stalin admired Lenin's leadership and worked to support Bolshevik goals. By 1905, Stalin had attended key party meetings and worked in secret to raise funds for the revolution. He also helped plan robberies to fund the Bolshevik movement. Between 1905 and 1912, Stalin was arrested and exiled several more times. Despite these setbacks, he continued to grow within the Bolshevik Party. Stalin was known for his determination and ability to organize workers. He was often sent to handle dangerous or challenging tasks for the party. In 1912, Lenin appointed Stalin to the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. This was a significant step in Stalin's rise to power within the revolutionary movement. During these years, Stalin began using the name Stalin, meaning man of steel. This name reflected his tough personality and strong will. He also wrote articles and pamphlets to explain Marxist ideas to workers and inspire them to join the revolution. His writings made him more influential. Although Stalin was not yet a major leader, his loyalty to Lenin and the Bolshevik cause earned him respect. He became an important figure behind the scenes. Stalin's early revolutionary work was marked by his willingness to take risks and face danger. These experiences shaped his reputation as a tough and resourceful leader. His efforts helped lay the foundation for his future rise in the Bolshevik Party. Stalin proved that he could survive challenges and remain committed to his goals. These qualities would later play a key role in his ability to outmaneuver rivals and solidify his power in the Soviet Union after the revolution. Stalin's rise to power began after the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar and seized control. Stalin quickly aligned himself with Lenin's leadership. During the Civil War, 1918-1920, Stalin served as a military and political leader in various regions. He helped secure Bolshevik control by organizing supplies and commanding troops. Lenin noticed Stalin's administrative abilities and gave him important roles in the new government, including Commissar for Nationalities and Workers' and Peasants' Inspection. In 1922, Stalin became General Secretary of the Communist Party. This position gave him control over appointments and decisions, allowing him to build a network of loyal supporters. Lenin began to distrust Stalin's growing power and criticized his harsh methods. In 1924, Lenin wrote a political testament recommending Stalin's removal from the party leadership. However, Lenin's death in 1924 gave Stalin an opportunity to consolidate power. He used his influence to suppress Lenin's warnings and strengthen his position within the party. Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals, including Leon Trotsky, who had been seen as Lenin's likely successor. Stalin portrayed Trotsky as unfaithful to Lenin's vision and isolated him. Stalin also formed alliances with other leaders, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, only to later turn against them. By 1927, Trotsky and his supporters were expelled from the Communist Party. Stalin then turned on his remaining rivals, including Bukharin and Rykov. He accused them of opposing the party's goals and removed them from power through political manipulation. By the late 1920s, Stalin had established himself as the uncontested leader of the Soviet Union. His rivals had been defeated, and his authority over the Communist Party was absolute. Stalin promoted the idea of socialism in one country, arguing that the Soviet Union could succeed without waiting for worldwide revolution. This policy was popular with party members. Stalin used his growing influence to reshape the Soviet Union's policies, preparing the country for his ambitious plans for industrialization and agricultural collectivization. Stalin's ability to outmaneuver his opponents and consolidate power was key to his success. His leadership style combined strategic thinking, manipulation, and ruthless tactics. Although his rise to power was marked by betrayal and conflict, Stalin's control of the Communist Party laid the foundation for his totalitarian regime. This period of Stalin's life revealed his skill in political maneuvering, as well as his willingness to use any means necessary to achieve dominance in Soviet politics. In the late 1920s, Stalin launched a series of radical policies to transform the Soviet Union's economy. These plans focused on rapid industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture. Stalin introduced the first five-year plan in 1928. Its goal was to expand heavy industries like steel, coal, and machinery, aiming to modernize the country and prepare it for war. This plan demanded high production targets and tight government control. Workers faced long hours in harsh conditions, and failure to meet quotas could result in severe punishments. While industrialization brought rapid growth, it came at a high cost. Workers endured poor living conditions, shortages of goods, and constant pressure to meet unrealistic goals. Stalin's focus on heavy industry ignored consumer needs, leaving ordinary people with little access to basic items like clothing and food. These sacrifices were justified as necessary for progress. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's top industrial nations. Factories, railways, and power plants were built, but the human cost of these achievements was immense. Collectivization was Stalin's second major policy. It forced peasants to give up their private farms and join large, state-controlled collectives to increase agricultural efficiency. Resistance was widespread, as many peasants opposed losing their land. Stalin labeled resisting farmers as kulaks and treated them as enemies of the state. Troops and secret police were sent to enforce collectivization. Kulaks were arrested, exiled, or executed. Entire villages were destroyed in Stalin's effort to crush opposition. Collectivization caused a massive famine in Ukraine and other regions from 1932 to 1933. Millions of people starved as grain was taken to meet state demands or sold abroad. In Ukraine, this famine became known as the Holodomor, meaning death by hunger. Stalin's policies worsened the crisis by refusing to send relief to starving areas. Some historians argue this famine was deliberate, meant to punish regions seen as disloyal to Stalin's rule. This remains a debated and painful topic in Soviet history. Despite the suffering, Stalin declared collectivization a success, claiming it had strengthened the Soviet state. Agricultural production, however, remained low for years. Industrialization was more successful, but it relied on fear, strict control, and forced labor. Stalin built a powerful economy, but millions suffered and died in the process. These policies reshaped the Soviet Union, turning it into a major world power, but their impact on ordinary people was devastating and left scars for generations. In the 1930s, Stalin began a series of purges to eliminate anyone he considered a threat. These purges targeted Communist Party members, military leaders, and ordinary citizens. The Great Purges officially started in 1934, after the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a high-ranking Soviet official. Stalin used this event as an excuse to launch mass arrests. Many historians believe Stalin orchestrated Kirov's death to justify widespread repression. This marked the beginning of years of terror and bloodshed in the Soviet Union. Stalin's purges were carried out by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. They arrested millions on charges of treason, sabotage, or being enemies of the state. Most accusations were false. People were often forced to confess under torture or threats. Trials were staged, and those found guilty were executed or sent to labor camps. The labor camps, known as gulags, were brutal. Prisoners worked in harsh conditions with little food. Many died from starvation, disease, or exposure to the freezing weather. Stalin also targeted his political rivals. Key figures like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin were publicly tried and executed after being forced to admit to fake crimes. Even top military leaders, including Marshal Tukhachevsky, were accused of plotting against Stalin. Their deaths weakened the Soviet army just before World War II. The purges created a climate of fear. People were encouraged to denounce neighbors or co-workers, often to save themselves. Families were torn apart as arrests spread. Stalin's terror extended beyond politics. Writers, scientists, and artists were silenced if their work did not align with Stalin's vision. Independent thinking was dangerous. Ethnic minorities also suffered. Entire groups, like the Crimean Tatars and Chechens, were deported to remote areas under brutal conditions, accused of being disloyal. Historians estimate that millions died during Stalin's purges, while countless more were imprisoned. The purges helped Stalin maintain control, but at an unimaginable human cost. Stalin's use of fear and repression ensured no one could challenge his authority. By the late 1930s, he had removed almost all opposition. However, the purges also damaged the Soviet Union. The loss of skilled leaders and workers weakened the country, especially as World War II approached. The Great Purges left a legacy of fear and mistrust. Stalin's methods of control shaped the Soviet Union for decades, creating a society ruled by suspicion and silence. In 1939, Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany. This agreement divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and allowed both nations to expand. Shortly after the pact, Germany invaded Poland from the west, while the Soviet Union invaded from the east. This marked the beginning of World War II in Europe. Stalin used this time to annex territories like the Baltic states and parts of Romania. He also attacked Finland, though the Soviets faced unexpected resistance in the Winter War. Despite the pact, Hitler broke the agreement in 1941 by launching Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin was caught off guard by this attack. The German blitzkrieg advanced rapidly, capturing large areas of Soviet territory. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or taken prisoner in the early months of the war. Stalin initially struggled to respond. However, he quickly regrouped, declared himself commander-in-chief, and called on the Soviet people to defend their homeland. The Battle of Moscow in 1941 was a turning point. Soviet forces pushed back the German advance, marking the first major defeat for Hitler's army. Stalin stayed in Moscow to rally the nation. The most famous Soviet victory came in the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-1943. Fierce fighting turned the tide of the war as the Red Army forced German troops to surrender. Stalin's leadership in battles like Stalingrad and Kursk helped the Soviet Union regain lost territory. By 1945, the Red Army had marched into Berlin, ending the war in Europe. Stalin also played a significant role in diplomacy during the war. He met with Allied leaders, including Roosevelt and Churchill, at conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. These meetings shaped the post-war world. Stalin pushed to expand Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, laying the groundwork for the Cold War. While working with the Allies, Stalin remained suspicious of their intentions. He used negotiations to strengthen Soviet power, often outmaneuvering other leaders. The war's toll on the Soviet Union was immense. Over 20 million Soviet citizens died, and many cities were destroyed. Despite these losses, Stalin emerged as a powerful wartime leader. His leadership ensured the Soviet Union's role as a global superpower. However, his harsh policies, including forced labor and repression, continued even during the war. Stalin's actions during World War II cemented his image as both a national hero and a ruthless dictator. His role in the war remains a major part of his legacy. Joseph Stalin left behind a legacy that is deeply debated. Supporters view him as the leader who transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower. They credit him for rapid industrial growth, defeating Nazi Germany in World War II, and expanding Soviet influence across Eastern Europe during the Cold War. However, critics emphasize the immense human cost of his rule. Stalin's policies caused millions of deaths, widespread fear, and the loss of personal freedoms for the Soviet people. Stalin's industrial policies strengthened the Soviet economy, but ordinary citizens endured severe shortages of basic goods and harsh working conditions. His collectivization of agriculture created state control over farms, but caused mass famine, especially in Ukraine, where millions starved to death. The Great Purges destroyed political opponents and silenced dissent, but they also weakened the military and intellectual life of the country for years. After World War II, Stalin solidified Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Communist governments loyal to Moscow were installed, creating tensions with the West. These actions contributed to the Cold War, a long period of rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States that shaped global politics for decades. While Stalin expanded Soviet power abroad, his domestic policies continued to rely on fear and repression, keeping his people under tight control. Stalin's death in 1953 ended his direct influence, but the system he built remained. His successors ruled with less terror, but kept many of his policies in place. The memory of Stalin's rule created lasting fear. People remembered the purges and repression, which made them more willing to accept future restrictions. Over time, some Soviet citizens continued to view Stalin as a strong leader, while others saw him as a cruel tyrant responsible for enormous suffering. Historians remain divided on Stalin's legacy. Some see him as a genius in political strategy and state building, while others highlight his brutality and disregard for human life. Comparisons are often made to other authoritarian leaders like Hitler. Both ruled with fear, caused immense suffering, and left lasting impacts on history. Today, Stalin is remembered as a figure of immense power and controversy. His actions shaped the 20th century, but his methods remain a cautionary tale about unchecked authority.